Need this? Oh, now it's on. All right, well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. Tonight we will be presenting the 2023-2024 Scotia-Glenville School District budget that the board approved to go out to the public for vote in a couple of weeks. After that, Mr. Robert Hanlon will be moderating our Meet the Candidate night for the 4 candidates for the 3 open board spots this year. So this time I'll turn it over to Superintendent Schwartz and Business Manager Drew Giaquinto for the presentation.
Thank you. Oh, what's that, Kat? Okay. As we get started this evening, I'll just ask folks to remember and take a look at our Scotia-Glenville mission statement. This really is our guiding force for what we do as a school district, our commitment to our children and our community. So as we began our budget preparation this year with the board, as we do every year, we took a look at where we were in 22-23 and then what it would take to roll those exact same commitments forward. And to do that would have gotten us to a budget of $63.2 million roughly, which was a 4.45% spending increase. Although I think many of us thought that was reasonable, we also knew, given the economy and knowing our community, that we were going to need to take a look at that and see if we could make any changes. So as we came back for a second draft on the budget, we took a look at reducing our expenses. You can see that in the left-hand column by about $240,000, which got us to $62,959,582, which is 4.45 increase. Tax levy of 4.08, and what we would think will translate to a tax rate of 2.99. Would you add anything to that?
So the district's proposed budget has a 2.99% tax levy increase, which is the amount of tax revenue we're going to generate from the taxable entities in the school district. That would correlate to a 2.09% tax rate increase based on assessed value growth, primarily attributable to the target business coming off a payment in lieu of tax agreement next year and going on the tax rolls. So again, 2.99 is the tax levy, that's the tax revenue. That's under the tax cap of 4.33. That was the maximum allowable tax cap that the state gives us under the formula. So that's where we are.
When we talk about budget, we're interested in 3 primary buckets. So administrative costs, program costs, and then capital costs. And what we've done here is provide a bit of a historical perspective on those 3 buckets, if you will, which contain all of our spending. But you can see we have been pretty consistent in terms of what we spend as a district in each of those areas. And that truly is by design. We have tried very hard in my tenure here and in Mr. Giaquinto's tenure here to prevent having spikes in the budget that would result in greater increases for our community. So keeping things on as even a keel as possible. People often ask, what happens if the budget fails? So this is a slide about our contingency budget. I'm going to ask Drew to speak to those numbers a little bit. But I would tell you that if we aren't able to pass the budget on Tuesday the 16th, we can take a budget back out to the voters so we can go one more time, or we can adopt what's called a contingency budget. So there will be certain things that we will have to reduce. And those reductions will have to be proportional to those 3 areas: admin, capital, and thank you.
So a contingent budget requires you to maintain the same tax levy as the prior year, which would be a $941,000 reduction in our budget if it went down twice. And that three-part budget that Susan had in the previous slide, you have to stay in the proportion administratively and programmatically. You just can't cut one side. You got to stay in proportion to the last presented budget or the previous adopted budget, whichever had, and it's in the language there, not to make it too confusing. But the 941 just can't come out of program, which is the teaching side of the business, and transportation. It's got to come out of both admin and the program proportion. That help?
Thank you. And here's how we break down the budget when we look at the different areas that comprise the budget. So we have general supplies, our plant operations, instruction, transportation, employee benefits, our debt service, and our transfer fund. What I think it's always important to point out to folks is that we are a people-heavy enterprise, and as you would expect, our staffing is 53% of our budget, almost 54%, and our employee benefits are another 25%. So when you think about it that way, we spend, as a school district, about 75% of our budget on instruction. And well, we should. Personnel and also all of the things that make for good teaching. The source of our funds is the bottom half of this slide, bottom part of this slide. So state aid is 38.5% of our budget. That's money that is generated through the state based on our enrollment. Taxes, our community taxes, and our pilots, our payment in lieu of taxes, is about 54% of our budget. So I always think of that in terms of our community is paying a greater share of the cost. We will use 6.5% of our fund balance. And then there's a small other revenue that we can also tap into. And Drew, I'm going to ask you just to talk a bit about fund balance and where that comes from and how we do that.
A quick note on state aid. As you can see, it was 2% more as a proportion of the budget than the prior year averages. As you know, the governor and the legislature have fully funded foundation aid through 23-24. Our foundation aid went up 8%. That's due to the consumer price index. Inflation was about 8%. That's in the formula. Fund balance is basically what we save every year when our expenses are less than the revenues. And we put that in what they call an unassigned fund balance, which we can keep 4% of the ensuing year's budget in fund balance. We then appropriate that in lieu of raising taxes, and as Susan alluded to, it funds about 6.5% of our budget, a little less than the last year because we got more state aid.
And because we wanted to be mindful, our tax levy limit was higher this year than it has been for the past several years. Last year, I believe it was 1.62%. This year, it was over 4%. But you really have to take that long view when you think about what you would want for your community. So this projects what we think could happen in 5 years, so a 5-year projected budget. And again, we're trying to keep a more consistent approach so that folks in the community know what to expect, no real highs, no real lows. We are very proud of the fact that in the last 10 years we were actually able to set a negative tax rate and save our community some money. And you will see that after this year where we get this bump in state aid, we would expect that state aid will level out at around the 2% that we typically see. You might have heard of school districts receiving millions of additional dollars in state aid, and there are many districts that did. We are not that district because we were closer to being fully funded. So it has to do with what the wealth of your community is, what's called the average wealth needs ratio, and then how that plays out with your enrollments and then the allowance for state aid. So I know I've had several people ask me why Mohanison got so much more money than Scotia-Glenville did. They were less funded than we were to start with. Do you want to add anything about that? And Mr. Giaquinto has done what we typically do for folks with a bit more information. So we're taking a look at if that 2.09 is the tax rate increase, what would that mean for a home assessed at $160,000 or a home assessed at $200,000? What would the change in your tax rate be? And as Drew often says, yes, you look at the actual number in dollars, but that's on top of whatever you were already paying. So you can look at that 2023 taxes and then what we project for the coming year and see what that bump up looks like. Do you want to add anything? Okay. When you see the board the board vote ballot, there are three things that you're going to take a look at. One is our proposed budget of $62 million, almost $63 million. I always say to folks, what you are adopting is a spending limit. So the school district can't spend more than $62,959,582. However, because like any other organization, things change during the year, we try to leave ourselves with some flexibility to move money under that cap if in fact we have other things that come up. I always immediately think of COVID now, because the year that COVID struck, we had to shut down and we had to go buy a lot of PPE, neither of which were part of the budget that year. So we have to have some room to navigate. We're also going to bring you a bus proposition for $415,000, shows you what we're going to purchase. With the way we handle our bus proposition, we have a obsolescence model that we use, so we keep track of how much mileage is on a bus, how much time it spends on the road versus if it's off-road. And then we try to replace somewhere between 3 and 5 buses in a given year based on our needs and also the needs in the fleet. So it's a very well-documented process. It's not willy-nilly per se. And then we have 4 board candidates who you'll hear from this evening running for 3 open board seats. So with that, we'll be happy to take any questions folks might have. Yes, Mr. O'Neill.
So the projection over the next 5 years is a roughly 2.5% increase. And you said 78% of the total budget is basically staff costs. So does that mean you've got a 5-year contract with 2.5% for your teachers?
Absolutely not. It's an extrapolation of historical trend, bringing it forward on a formula. So it's a projection based on how things have gone up historically and projecting into the subsequent years, because as you settle contracts, we have debt service that'll change, we have supply issues that'll change. So there's a myriad of factors. It's 600 items in the budget. You go through it and you do a trend on it. So it's just to give the board a look forward that we had historically a high increase this year. We've never had this before, so I wanted to show them the impact going forward if the trend continued. That's the 2.5. It's not based on a 5-year contract with teachers or 766 or anything like that. It's the historical trend.
So what is the percentage of the salary increases that are under contract that represents the 78% of your budget?
Typically, the contracts have been settled at 3.5 to 4%, but you also have retirements that are worked into this, breakage, and so forth. So that's all in the soup, so to speak. Thank you.
Yes?
I just had a question about the bus. I think I read the return report for the buses. And it's often been said this way over the years, that it doesn't have an impact on this year's taxes. But is it inherent in that statement that it's going to have an effect in the future? Is it going to get paid off over time and that it's possibly increasing years to come? A little more on this.
It's a great question. What we try to do is bonds are coming off the books. The new ones are coming on, so it's like a minimal impact on the future year's budget. In the initial presentation to the board, there was a slide on how that worked itself out. We can provide that to you. But what I try to do is make sure that we keep this going as buses are coming off the books, the debt, new debt's coming on, so we always have that, the aid and the debt kind of going in synchronicity, so there's not a spike. So it's very minimal, this, and the 2024-25 budget, because of debt coming off. So it's a great question.
And also, let's see, we also are aided.
That's what I- yeah.
Oh, yes, on our post purchases. Yes, Ms. Kavitsky.
I think I interpreted it correctly, but it says something in terms of increasing funds in incoming funds with Medicaid. And I didn't know how we would, I think that it's under in parentheses that means it's going to be increased. How would we increase this district, our Medicaid?
It's another good question, and the answer is that we're now claiming for services that we previously couldn't do, but we're now eligible to claim for them. It's been a lot of work with our new PPS director. Katie's done a great job. So we're seeing an influx of aid from certain counseling services that we weren't able to claim before. So we're going to recognize it to help alleviate the expense increase and mitigate the tax increase.
Any other questions?
I'm a little rusty on looking at these, I guess. Under the three buckets you talked about, give us a sample.
Building and grounds, that's your plant maintenance, that's your health and safety. That's why we don't touch it in contingency, because you gotta keep the heat on, you gotta keep the buildings clean. You're welcome.
Seeing no other questions, we're going to close the budget hearing, and I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Hanlon, who will conduct our Meet the Candidates night.
Are we going to do that immediately or wait till 7:30?
No, I think we'll start. Is it okay with folks if we start timeout? So we'll take a little break.
Okay.